Israeli-Palestinian conflict issues in dispute. The following outlined positions are the official positions of the two parties. However, it is important to note that neither side holds a single position. Both the Israeli and the Palestinian sides include both moderate and extremist bodies as well as dovish and hawkish bodies. One of the primary obstacles to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a deep-set and growing distrust between its participants. Unilateral strategies and the rhetoric of hardline political factions, coupled with violence and incitements by civilians against one another, have fostered mutual embitterment and hostility and a loss of faith in the peace process. Support among Palestinians for Hamas is considerable, and as its members consistently call for the destruction of Israel and violence remains a threat, security becomes a prime concern for many Israelis. The expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank has led the majority of Palestinians to believe that Israel is not committed to reaching an agreement, but rather to a pursuit of establishing permanent control over this territory in order to provide that security. Jerusalem. The control of Jerusalem is a particularly delicate issue, with each side asserting claims over this city. The three largest Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, hold Jerusalem as an important setting for their religious and historical narratives. Jerusalem is the holiest city in the world for Judaism, being the former location of the Jewish temples on the Temple Mount and the capital of the ancient Israelite kingdom. For Muslims, Jerusalem is the site of Muhammad's night journey to heaven, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. For Christians, Jerusalem is the site of Jesus' crucifixion and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Israeli government, including the Knesset and Supreme Court, is centered in the new city of West Jerusalem and has been since Israel's founding in 1948. After Israel captured the Jordanian-controlled East Jerusalem in the Six-Day War, it assumed complete administrative control of East Jerusalem. In 1980, Israel issued a new law stating that Jerusalem, complete and united, is the capital of Israel. Many countries do not recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, notable exceptions being Israel, the United States, and Russia. The majority of UN member states and most international organizations do not recognize Israel's ownership of East Jerusalem, which occurred after the 1967 Six-Day War, nor its 1980 Jerusalem Law Proclamation. The International Court of Justice, in its 2004 advisory opinion on the legal consequences of the construction of a wall in the occupied Palestinian territory, described East Jerusalem as occupied Palestinian territory. As of 2005, there were more than 719,000 people living in Jerusalem, 465,000 were Jews, mostly living in West Jerusalem, and 232,000 were Muslims, mostly living in East Jerusalem. At the Camp David and Taba summits in 2000 to 2001, the United States proposed a plan in which the Arab parts of Jerusalem would be given to the proposed Palestinian state while the Jewish parts of Jerusalem were given to Israel. All archaeological work under the Temple Mount would be jointly controlled by the Israeli and Palestinian governments. Both sides accepted the proposal in principle, but the summits ultimately failed. Israel expresses concern over the security of its residents if neighborhoods of Jerusalem are placed under Palestinian control. Jerusalem has been a prime target for attacks by militant groups against civilian targets since 1967. Many Jewish neighborhoods have been fired upon from Arab areas. The proximity of the Arab areas, if these regions were to fall on the boundaries of a Palestinian state, would be so close as to threaten the safety of Jewish residents. Holy sites. Israel has concerns regarding the welfare of Jewish holy places under possible Palestinian control. When Jerusalem was under Jordanian control, no Jews were allowed to visit the Western Wall or other Jewish holy places, and the Jewish cemetery on the Mount of Olives was desecrated. Since 1975, Israel has banned Muslims from worshipping at Joseph's tomb, a shrine considered sacred by both Jews and Muslims. Settlers established a yeshiva, installed the Torah scroll and covered the mihrab. During the Second Intifada, the site was looted and burned. Israeli security agencies routinely monitor and arrest Jewish extremists that plan attacks, though many serious incidents have still occurred. Israel has allowed almost complete autonomy to the Muslim Trust, Waqf, over the Temple Mount. Palestinians have voiced concerns regarding the welfare of Christian and Muslim holy places under Israeli control. Additionally, some Palestinian advocates have made statements alleging that the Western Wall tunnel was reopened with the intent of causing the mosque's collapse. The Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs denied this claim in a 1996 speech to the United Nations and characterized the statement as escalation of rhetoric. Palestinian refugees. Palestinian refugees are people who lost both their homes and means of livelihood as a result of the 1948 Arab-Israeli conflict and the 1967 Six-Day War. The number of Palestinians who fled or were expelled from Israel following its creation was estimated at 711,000 in 1949. Descendants of these original Palestinian refugees are also eligible for registration and services provided by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, and as of 2010 number 4.7 million people. Between 350,000 and 400,000 Palestinians were displaced during the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. A third of the refugees live in recognized refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The remainder live in and around the cities and towns of these host countries. Most of these people were born outside Israel, but are descendants of original Palestinian refugees. Palestinian negotiators, most notably Yasser Arafat, have so far publicly insisted that refugees have a right to return to the places where they lived before 1948 and 1967, including those within the 1949 armistice lines, citing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and UN General Assembly Resolution 194 as evidence. However, according to reports of private peace negotiations with Israel, they have countenanced the return of only 10,000 refugees and their families to Israel as part of a peace settlement. Mahmoud Abbas, the current chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, was reported to have said in private discussion that it is illogical to ask Israel to take 5 million, or indeed 1 million. That would mean the end of Israel. In a further interview, Abbas stated that he no longer had an automatic right to return to Safed in the northern Galilee where he was born in 1935. He later clarified that the remark was his personal opinion and not official policy. The Arab Peace Initiative of 2002 declared that it proposed the compromise of a just resolution of the refugee problem. Palestinian and international authors have justified the right of return of the Palestinian refugees on several grounds. Several scholars included in the broader New Historians argue that the Palestinian refugees were chased out or expelled by the actions of the Haganah, Lehi, and Irgun, Zionist paramilitary groups. A number have also characterized this as an ethnic cleansing. The New Historians cite indications of Arab leaders' desire for the Palestinian Arab population to stay put. Schlaim, 2000, states that from April 1948 the military forces of what was to become Israel had embarked on a new offensive strategy which involved destroying Arab villages and the forced removal of civilians. The Israeli law of return that grants citizenship to any Jew from anywhere in the world is viewed by some as discrimination against non-Jews, especially Palestinians that cannot apply for such citizenship or return to the territory which they were expelled from or fled during the course of the 1948 war. According to the UN Resolution 194, adopted in 1948, the refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return and for loss of or damage to property which, under principles of international law or in equity, should be made good by the governments or authorities responsible. UN Resolution 3236 reaffirms also the inalienable right of the Palestinians to return to their homes and property from which they have been displaced and uprooted, and calls for their return. Resolution 242 from the UN affirms the necessity for achieving a just settlement of the refugee problem. However, Resolution 242 does not specify that the just settlement must or should be in the form of a literal Palestinian right of return. The most common arguments for opposition are: the Israeli government asserts that the Arab refugee problem is largely caused by the refusal of all Arab governments except Jordan to grant citizenship to Palestinian Arabs who reside within those countries' borders. This has produced much of the poverty and economic problems of the refugees, according to MFA documents. The Palestinian refugee issue is handled by a separate authority from that handling other refugees, that is, by UNRWA and not the UNHCR. Most of the people recognizing themselves as Palestinian refugees would have otherwise been assimilated into their country of current residency, and would not maintain their refugee state if not for the separate entities. Concerning the origin of the Palestinian refugees, the official version of the Israeli government is that during the 1948 war the Arab Higher Committee and the Arab states encouraged Palestinians to flee in order to make it easier to rout the Jewish state, or that they did so to escape the fights by fear. The Palestinian narrative is that refugees were expelled and dispossessed by Jewish militias and by the Israeli army, following a plan established even before the war. Historians still debate the causes of the 1948 Palestinian exodus. Since none of the 900,000 Jewish refugees who fled anti-Semitic violence in the Arab world was ever compensated or repatriated by their former countries of residence, to no objection on the part of Arab leaders, a precedent has been set whereby it is the responsibility of the nation which accepts the refugees to assimilate them. Although Israel accepts the right of the Palestinian diaspora to return into a new Palestinian state, Israel insists that their return into the current state of Israel would be a great danger for the stability of the Jewish state. An influx of Palestinian refugees would lead to the destruction of the state of Israel. Historian Benny Morris states that most of Palestine's 700,000 refugees fled because of the flail of war and expected to return home shortly after a successful Arab invasion. He documents instances in which Arab leaders advised the evacuation of entire communities, as happened in Haifa. In his scholarly work, however, he does conclude that there were expulsions which were carried out. Morris considers the displacement the result of a national conflict initiated by the Arabs themselves. In a 2004 interview with Haaretz, he described the exodus as largely resulting from an atmosphere of transfer that was promoted by Ben-Gurion and understood by the military leadership. He also claimed that there are circumstances in history that justify ethnic cleansing. He has been criticized by political scientist Norman Finkelstein for having seemingly changed his views for political, rather than historical, reasons. According to Karsh, the Palestinians were themselves the aggressors in the 1948–1949 war who attempted to cleanse a neighboring ethnic community. Had the United Nations resolution of November 29, 1947 recommending partition in Palestine not been subverted by force by the Arab world, there would have been no refugee problem in the first place. He reports of large numbers of Palestinian refugees leaving even before the outbreak of the 1948 war because of disillusionment and economic privation. The British High Commissioner for Palestine spoke of the collapsing Arab morale in Palestine that he partially attributed to the increasing tendency of those who should be leading them to leave the country and the considerable evacuations of the Arab Effendi class. Huge numbers of Palestinians were also expelled by their leadership to prevent them from becoming Israeli citizens, and in Haifa and Tiberias, tens of thousands of Arabs were forcibly evacuated on the instructions of the Arab Higher Committee. Israeli security concerns. Throughout the conflict, Palestinian violence has been a concern for Israelis. Israel, along with the United States and the European Union, refer to the violence against Israeli civilians and military forces by Palestinian militants as terrorism. The motivations behind Palestinian violence against Israeli civilians are multiplex, and not all violent Palestinian groups agree with each other on specifics. Nonetheless, a common motive is the desire to destroy Israel and replace it with a Palestinian Arab state. The most prominent Islamist groups, such as Hamas, view the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a religious jihad. Suicide bombing is used as a tactic among Palestinian organizations like Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, and certain suicide attacks have received support among Palestinians as high as 84%. In Israel, Palestinian suicide bombers have targeted civilian buses, restaurants, shopping malls, hotels and marketplaces. From 1993 to 2003, 303 Palestinian suicide bombers attacked Israel. The Israeli government initiated the construction of a security barrier following scores of suicide bombings and terrorist attacks in July 2003. Israel's coalition government approved a security barrier in the northern part of the Green Line between Israel and the West Bank. According to the IDF, since the erection of the fence, terrorist acts have declined by approximately 90%. Since 2001, the threat of Qassam rockets fired from the Palestinian territories into Israel is also of great concern for Israeli defense officials. In 2006, the year following Israel's disengagement from the Gaza Strip, the Israeli government recorded 1,726 such launches, more than 4 times the total rockets fired in 2005. As of January 2009, over 8,600 rockets had been launched, causing widespread psychological trauma and disruption of daily life. Over 500 rockets and mortars hit Israel in January to September 2010, and over 1,947 rockets hit Israel in January to November 2012. According to a study conducted by University of Haifa, 1 in 5 Israelis have lost a relative or friend in a Palestinian terrorist attack. There is significant debate within Israel about how to deal with the country's security concerns. Options have included military action, including targeted killings and house demolitions of terrorist operatives, diplomacy, unilateral gestures toward peace, and increased security measures such as checkpoints, roadblocks, and security barriers. The legality and the wisdom of all of the above tactics have been called into question by various commentators. Since mid-June 2007, Israel's primary means of dealing with security concerns in the West Bank has been to cooperate with and permit United States-sponsored training, equipping, and funding of the Palestinian Authority's security forces, which with Israeli help have largely succeeded in quelling West Bank supporters of Hamas. Palestinian violence outside Israel. Some Palestinians have committed violent acts over the globe on the pretext of a struggle against Israel. Many foreigners, including Americans and Europeans, have been killed and injured by Palestinian militants. At least 53 Americans have been killed and 83 injured by Palestinian violence since the signing of the Oslo Accords. During the late 1960s, the PLO became increasingly infamous for its use of international terror. In 1969 alone, the PLO was responsible for hijacking 82 planes. El Al Airlines became a regular hijacking target. The hijacking of Air France Flight 139 by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine culminated during a hostage rescue mission, where Israeli special forces successfully rescued the majority of the hostages. However, one of the most well-known and notorious terrorist acts was the capture and eventual murder of 11 Israeli athletes during the 1972 Olympic Games. Palestinian violence against other Palestinians. Fighting among rival Palestinian and Arab movements has played a crucial role in shaping Israel's security policy towards Palestinian militants, as well as in the Palestinian leadership's own policies. As early as the 1930s, revolts in Palestine, Arab forces fought each other while also skirmishing with Zionist and British forces, and internal conflicts continue to the present day. During the Lebanese Civil War, Palestinian Baathists broke from the Palestine Liberation Organization and allied with the Shia Amal movement, fighting a bloody civil war that killed thousands of Palestinians. In the First Intifada, more than 1,000 Palestinians were killed in a campaign initiated by the Palestine Liberation Organization to crack down on suspected Israeli security service informers and collaborators. The Palestinian Authority was strongly criticized for its treatment of alleged collaborators, rights groups complaining that those labeled collaborators were denied fair trials. According to a report released by the Palestinian Human Rights Monitoring Group, less than 45% of those killed were actually guilty of informing for Israel. The policies towards suspected collaborators contravene agreements signed by the Palestinian leadership. Article 16(2) of the Oslo II Agreement states, Palestinians who have maintained contact with the Israeli authorities will not be subjected to acts of harassment, violence, retribution, or prosecution. The provision was designed to prevent Palestinian leaders from imposing retribution on fellow Palestinians who had worked on behalf of Israel during the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. In the Gaza Strip, Hamas officials have tortured and killed thousands of Fatah members and other Palestinians who opposed the rule. During the Battle of Gaza, more than 150 Palestinians died over a 4-day period. The violence among Palestinians was described as a civil war by some commentators. By 2007, more than 600 Palestinian people had died during the struggle between Hamas and Fatah. International status. In the past, Israel has demanded control over border crossings between the Palestinian territories and Jordan and Egypt, and the right to set the import and export controls, asserting that Israel and the Palestinian territories are a single economic space. In the interim agreements reached as part of the Oslo Accords, the Palestinian Authority has received control over cities, Area A, while the surrounding countryside has been placed under Israeli security and Palestinian civil administration, Area B, or complete Israeli control, Area C. Israel has built additional highways to allow Israelis to traverse the area without entering Palestinian cities. The initial areas under Palestinian Authority control are diverse and non-contiguous. The areas have changed over time because of subsequent negotiations, including Oslo II, Y River and Sharm el-Sheikh. According to Palestinians, the separated areas make it impossible to create a viable nation and fails to address Palestinian security needs. Israel has expressed no agreement to withdrawal from some areas resulting in no reduction in the division of the Palestinian areas, and the institution of a safe pass system, without Israeli checkpoints, between these parts. Water resources. In the Middle East, water resources are of great political concern. Since Israel receives much of its water from two large underground aquifers which continue under the Green Line, the use of this water has been contentious in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israel withdraws most water from these areas, but it also supplies the West Bank with approximately 40 million cubic meters annually, contributing to 77% of Palestinians' water supply in the West Bank, which is to be shared for a population of about 2.6 million. While Israel's consumption of this water has decreased since it began its occupation of the West Bank, it still consumes the majority of it. In the 1950s, Israel consumed 95% of the water output of the Western Aquifer, and 82% of that produced by the Northeastern Aquifer. Although this water was drawn entirely on Israel's own side of the pre-1967 border, the sources of the water are nevertheless from the shared groundwater basins located under both West Bank and Israel. In the Oslo II Accord, both sides agreed to maintain existing quantities of utilization from the resources. In so doing, the Palestinian Authority established the legality of Israeli water production in the West Bank, subject to a Joint Water Committee, JWC. Moreover, Israel obligated itself in this agreement to provide water to supplement Palestinian production, and further agreed to allow additional Palestinian drilling in the Eastern Aquifer, also subject to the Joint Water Committee. Many Palestinians counter that the Oslo II agreement was intended to be a temporary resolution and that it was not intended to remain in effect more than a decade later. In 1999, Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs said it continued to honor its obligations under the interim agreement. The water that Israel receives comes mainly from the Jordan River system, the Sea of Galilee and two underground sources. According to a 2003 BBC article, the Palestinians lack access to the Jordan River system. According to a report of 2008 by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, water resources were confiscated for the benefit of the Israeli settlements in the core. Palestinian irrigation pumps on the Jordan River were destroyed or confiscated after the 1967 war, and Palestinians were not allowed to use water from the Jordan River system. Furthermore, the authorities did not allow any new irrigation wells to be drilled by Palestinian farmers, while it provided fresh water and allowed drilling wells for irrigation purposes at the Jewish settlements in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. A report was released by the UN in August 2012, and Max Gaillard, the UN resident and humanitarian coordinator in the occupied Palestinian territory, explained at the launch of the publication, Gaza will have 500,000 more people by 2020 while its economy will grow only slowly. In consequence, the people of Gaza will have an even harder time getting enough drinking water and electricity, or sending their children to school. Gaillard, present alongside Jean Goff, of the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, and Robert Turner, of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA. The report projects that Gaza's population will increase from 1.6 million people to 2.1 million people in 2020, leading to a density of more than 5,800 people per square kilometer. Future and financing. Numerous foreign nations and international organizations have established bilateral agreements with the Palestinian and Israeli water authorities. It is estimated that a future investment of about $1.1 billion for the West Bank and $0.8 billion is needed for the planning period from 2003 to 2015. In order to support and improve the water sector in the Palestinian territories, a number of bilateral and multilateral agencies have been supporting many different water and sanitation programs. There are 3 large seawater desalination plants in Israel and 2 more scheduled to open before 2014. When the 4th plant becomes operational, 65% of Israel's water will come from desalination plants, according to Minister of Finance Dr. Yuval Steinitz. In late 2012, a donation of $21.6 million was announced by the government of the Netherlands. The Dutch government stated that the funds would be provided to the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, for the specific benefit of Palestinian children. An article, published by the UN News website, stated that, of the $21.6 million, $5.70 will be allocated to UNRWA's 2012 emergency appeal for the occupied Palestinian territory, which will support programs in the West Bank and Gaza aiming to mitigate the effects on refugees of the deteriorating situation they face. Israeli military occupation of the West Bank. Occupied Palestinian territory is the term used by the United Nations to refer to the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, territories which were captured by Israel during the 1967 Six-Day War, having formerly been controlled by Egypt and Jordan. The Israeli government uses the term disputed territories to argue that some territories cannot be called occupied as no nation had clear rights to them and there was no operative diplomatic arrangement when Israel acquired them in June 1967. The area is still referred to as Judea and Samaria, based on the historical regional names from ancient times. This is also the name used on the 1947 UN partition plan. In 1980, Israel annexed East Jerusalem. Israel has never annexed the West Bank, apart from East Jerusalem, or Gaza Strip, and the United Nations has demanded the termination of all claims or states of belligerency and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity and political independence of every state in the area and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries free from threats or acts of force, and that Israeli forces withdraw from territories occupied in the recent conflict. The meaning and intent of the latter phrase is disputed. See interpretations. It has been the position of Israel that the most Arab-populated parts of West Bank, without major Jewish settlements, as well as the entire Gaza Strip, must eventually be part of an independent Palestinian state. However, the precise borders of this state are in question. At Camp David, for example, then Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak offered Arafat an opportunity to establish a non-militarized Palestinian state. The proposed state would consist of 77% of the West Bank split into 2 or 3 areas, followed by an increase of 86 to 91% of the West Bank after 6 to 21 years, autonomy, but not sovereignty for some of the Arab neighborhoods of East Jerusalem surrounded by Israeli territory, the entire Gaza Strip, and the dismantling of most settlements. Arafat rejected the proposal without providing a counteroffer. A subsequent settlement proposed by President Clinton offered Palestinian sovereignty over 94 to 96% of the West Bank but was similarly rejected with 52 objections. The Arab League has agreed to the principle of minor and mutually agreed land swaps as part of a negotiated two-state settlement based on June 1967 borders. Official U.S. policy also reflects the ideal of using the 1967 borders as a basis for an eventual peace agreement. Some Palestinians claim they are entitled to all of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. Israel says it is justified in not ceding all this land, because of security concerns, and also because the lack of any valid diplomatic agreement at the time means that ownership and boundaries of this land is open for discussion. Palestinians claim any reduction of this claim is a severe deprivation of their rights. In negotiations, they claim that any moves to reduce the boundaries of this land is a hostile move against their key interests. Israel considers this land to be in dispute, and feels the purpose of negotiations is to define what the final borders will be. Other Palestinian groups, such as Hamas, have in the past insisted that Palestinians must control not only the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, but also all of Israel proper. For this reason, Hamas has viewed the peace process as religiously forbidden and politically inconceivable. Israeli settlements in the West Bank. According to the Arizona Department of Emergency and Military Affairs, DEMA, in the years following the Six-Day War, and especially in the 1990s during the peace process, Israel re-established communities destroyed in 1929 and 1948 as well as established numerous new settlements in the West Bank. These settlements are, as of 2009, home to about 301,000 people. DEMA added, most of the settlements are in the western parts of the West Bank, while others are deep into Palestinian territory, overlooking Palestinian cities. These settlements have been the site of much intercommunal conflict. The issue of Israeli settlements in the West Bank and, until 2005, the Gaza Strip, had been described by the UK and the WHO as an obstacle to the peace process. The United Nations and the European Union have also called the settlements illegal under international law. However, Israel disputes this. Several scholars and commentators disagree with the assessment that settlements are illegal, citing in 2005 recent historical trends to back up their argument. Those who justify the legality of the settlements use arguments based upon Articles 2 and 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, as well as UN Security Council Resolution 242. On a practical level, some objections voiced by Palestinians are that settlements divert resources needed by Palestinian towns, such as arable land, water, and other resources, and that settlements reduce Palestinians' ability to travel freely via local roads, owing to security considerations. In 2005, Israel's unilateral disengagement plan, a proposal put forward by Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, was enacted. All residents of Jewish settlements in the Gaza Strip were evacuated, and all residential buildings were demolished. Various mediators and various proposed agreements have shown some degree of openness to Israel retaining some fraction of the settlements which currently exist in the West Bank. This openness is based on a variety of considerations, such as the desire to find real compromise between Israeli and Palestinian territorial claims, Israel's position that it needs to retain some West Bank land and settlements as a buffer in case of future aggression, and Israel's position that some settlements are legitimate, as they took shape when there was no operative diplomatic arrangement, and thus they did not violate any agreement. Former U.S. President George W. Bush has stated that he does not expect Israel to return entirely to the 1949 armistice lines because of new realities on the ground. One of the main compromise plans put forth by the Clinton administration would have allowed Israel to keep some settlements in the West Bank, especially those which were in large blocks near the pre-1967 borders of Israel. In return, Palestinians would have received some concessions of land in other parts of the country. The current U.S. administration views a complete freeze of construction in settlements on the West Bank as a critical step toward peace. In May and June 2009, President Barack Obama said, "The United States does not accept the legitimacy of continued Israeli settlements," and the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, stated that the president wants to see a stop to settlements, not some settlements, not outposts, not natural growth exceptions. However, Obama has since declared that the United States will no longer press Israel to stop West Bank settlement construction as a precondition for continued peace process negotiations with the Palestinian Authority. Gaza blockade. The Israeli government states it is justified under international law to impose a blockade on an enemy for security reasons. The power to impose a naval blockade is established under customary international law and laws of armed conflict, and a United Nations Commission has ruled that Israel's blockade is both legal and appropriate. The Israeli government's continued land, sea and air blockage is tantamount to collective punishment of the population, according to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. The Military Advocate General of Israel has provided numerous reasonings for the policy. The State of Israel has been engaged in an ongoing armed conflict with terrorist organizations operating in the Gaza Strip. This armed conflict has intensified after Hamas violently took over Gaza, in June 2007, and turned the territory under its de facto control into a launching pad of mortar and rocket attacks against Israeli towns and villages in southern Israel. According to Oxfam, because of an import-export ban imposed on Gaza in 2007, 95% of Gaza's industrial operations were suspended. Out of 35,000 people employed by 3,900 factories in June 2005, only 1,750 people remained employed by 195 factories in June 2007. By 2010, Gaza's unemployment rate had risen to 40% with 80% of the population living on less than $2 a day. In January 2008, the Israeli government calculated how many calories per person were needed to prevent a humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip, and then subtracted 8% to adjust for the culture and experience of the Gazans. Details of the calculations were released following Israeli human rights organization Jaish's application to the High Court. Israel's coordinator of government activities in the territories, who drafted the plan, stated that the scheme was never formally adopted. This was not accepted by Jaish. Starting February 7, 2008, The Israeli government reduced the electricity it sells directly to Gaza. This follows the ruling of Israel's High Court of Justice's decision, which held, with respect to the amount of industrial fuel supplied to Gaza, that the clarification that we made indicates that the supply of industrial diesel fuel to the Gaza Strip in the winter months of last year was comparable to the amount that the respondents now undertake to allow into the Gaza Strip. This fact also indicates that the amount is reasonable and sufficient to meet the vital humanitarian needs in the Gaza Strip. Palestinian militants killed 2 Israelis in the process of delivering fuel to the Nahalaz fuel depot. With regard to Israel's plan, the court stated that calls for a reduction of 5% of the power supply in 3 of the 10 power lines that supply electricity from Israel to the Gaza Strip, to a level of 13.5 megawatts in 2 of the lines and 12.5 megawatts in the third line. We, the court, were convinced that this reduction does not breach the humanitarian obligations imposed on the State of Israel in the framework of the armed conflict being waged between it and the Hamas organization that controls the Gaza Strip. Our conclusion is based, in part, on the affidavit of the respondents indicating that the relevant Palestinian officials stated that they can reduce the load in the event limitations are placed on the power lines, and that they had used this capability in the past. On June 20, 2010, Israel's Security Cabinet approved a new system governing the blockade that would allow practically all non-military or dual-use items to enter the Gaza Strip. According to a cabinet statement, Israel would expand the transfer of construction materials designated for projects that have been approved by the Palestinian Authority, including schools, health institutions, water, sanitation and more, as well as projects that are under international supervision. Despite the easing of the land blockade, Israel will continue to inspect all goods bound for Gaza by sea at the port of Ashdod. Prior to a Gaza visit, scheduled for April 2013, Turkey's Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan explained to Turkish newspaper Hürriyet that the fulfillment of 3 conditions by Israel was necessary for friendly relations to resume between Turkey and Israel: an apology for the May 2010 Gaza flotilla raid. Prime Minister Netanyahu had delivered an apology to Erdogan by telephone on March 22, 2013, the awarding of compensation to the families affected by the raid, and the lifting of the Gaza blockade by Israel. The Turkish Prime Minister also explained in the Hürriyet interview, in relation to the April 2013 Gaza visit, "We will monitor the situation to see if the promises are kept or not." At the same time, Netanyahu affirmed that Israel would only consider exploring the removal of the Gaza blockade if peace, quiet, is achieved in the area. Agriculture. Since the beginning of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the conflict has been about land. When Israel became a state after the war in 1948, 77% of Palestine's land was used for the creation on the state. The majority of those living in Palestine at the time became refugees in other countries, and this first land crisis became the root of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Because the root of the conflict is with land, the disputes between Israel and Palestine are well manifested in the agriculture of Palestine. In Palestine, agriculture is a mainstay in the economy. The production of agricultural goods supports the population's sustenance needs and fuels Palestine's export economy. According to the Council for European-Palestinian Relations, the agricultural sector formally employs 13.4% of the population and informally employs 90% of the population. Over the past 10 years, unemployment rates in Palestine have increased and the agricultural sector became the most impoverished sector in Palestine. Unemployment rates peaked in 2008 when they reached 41% in Gaza. Palestinian agriculture suffers from numerous problems, including Israeli military and civilian attacks on farms and farmers, blockades to exportation of produce and importation of necessary inputs, widespread confiscation of land for nature reserves as well as military and settler use, confiscation and destruction of wells, and physical barriers within the West Bank. The West Bank barrier. With the construction of the separation barrier, the Israeli state promised free movement across regions. However, border closures, curfews, and checkpoints has significantly restricted Palestinian movement. In 2012, there were 99 fixed checkpoints and 310 flying checkpoints. The border restrictions impacted the imports and exports in Palestine and weakened the industrial and agricultural sectors because of the constant Israeli control in the West Bank and Gaza. In order for the Palestinian economy to be prosperous, the restrictions on Palestinian land must be removed. According to The Guardian and a report for World Bank, the Palestinian economy lost $3.4 billion, percent 35 of the annual GDP, to Israeli restrictions in the West Bank alone. Boycotts. In Gaza, the agricultural market suffers from economic boycotts and border closures and restrictions placed by Israel. The PA's Minister of Agriculture estimates that around $1.2 billion were lost in September 2006 because of these security measures. There has also been an economic embargo initiated by the West on Hamas-led Palestine, which has decreased the amount of imports and exports from Palestine. This embargo was brought on by Hamas' refusal to recognize Israel's right to statehood. As a result, the PA's 160,000 employees have not received their salaries in over 1 year.